Hello and welcome to this new Tricentis MOOC. Today we will be talking about API and OSV with Tosca 12, so we'll be going through some new features. Today I am joined by Robert Wagner. He is the product manager for API and OSV here at Tricentis. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Federico. Thanks for the invitation.
Also, it's me, Federico. I am a training consultant here at Tricentis. For today, before leaving Robert doing his presentation, I would like to go through some housekeeping rules as usual. For those who have seen them many times, well, sorry, but we have to go through them. As usual, you are all muted because you always ask a lot of questions, and if you want to ask them, please type them in the question box and we will be answering them, some of them live, some of them will be just typing the answers. If you want to see past recordings, please go to our website, tricentis.com/academy/MOOC. There you can see more than 30 MOOCs from the past. As usual, today we'll go through some concepts. Robert will illustrate some theoretical concepts. Then we have a live demonstration, and at the end we'll have our Q&A session. And now I'll be leaving.
Thanks, Federico, for the introduction. So I'll take over now. I have a couple topics prepared for you guys. I want to give you a short overview about the API tool landscape so you get an understanding how all this integrates into each other. Then I will present you the new API recording functionality in combination with service virtualization and, of course, also for API testing. The next topic will deal a little more with queues and topics like testing in the middleware. And I want to show you also a very cool new feature with the smart parameters where we identify business relevant parameters for parameterization on your test artifacts which you might have recorded but also created by Wistal or from anywhere else. And in the end, I will have a look at the new feature in 12.0 called fallback service virtualization. I think this is something pretty cool, and I'm really excited if some questions will pop up in the end for this new fancy feature. But let's have a quick look on the tool landscape. For the guys who are working with Tosca already, of course, here on the left side we have the Tosca Commander where all the test management takes place, module based testing and so on and so forth. Also, of course, API testing and service virtualization takes place in Tosca Commander. But we have a couple more tools here, like the API Scan on the very right, which is a lightweight tool. We introduced it a couple of releases ago already, but we put a lot of features into this in the last recent releases. And it's very close connected to the Tosca Commander. You can see the arrow in between where you can export and import test cases from the API Scan tool, but also vice versa for maintenance reasons. But it is also connected on the bottom you see to OSV, where you, for instance, can directly deploy virtual assets into your virtualization directly, or like download it or upload it from and to Tosca Commander. On the top, we have the so-called connection manager, because we found that connections is also something very valuable once created. It's pretty good you have them and you don't need to reconfigure them all the time. And the connection manager is more or less the central place where you deal with your connections. For instance, you can configure a connection in your API Scan and maybe you reuse it later in Tosca Commander. And so that's how our tools are integrated into each other. And maybe a couple more words to the API Scan. The idea was to faster and better scanning of definitions, for instance, so you have a more lightweight tool in the API Scan, so it's also non-licensed. For instance, you can copy the API Scan, it's an executable from your Tosca Commander installation directory, and just send it to somebody else in your organization, maybe to get you started with an API. And this guy can export a subset or the full API Scan project, and you can re-import it and import it into Tosca Commander for regression testing, for instance. So this should support our collaboration story. And of course, in the API Scan, there is the recorder integrated. I will demo a little later. And as already mentioned, this addresses more technical user. And the idea is to collaborate with devs, for instance. On the top here, we have the connection manager. The idea is like once you've configured a connection in the API scan, you can more or less create a connection out of it. And in the connection manager, you can manage these connections centralized. And also, the persistency take place for the guys who are familiar with test configuration parameters. We basically store everything as test configuration parameters, but a connection manager is more or less a unified user interface to make connection management more easy. But still, you could do that all with configuration parameters. And yeah, API engine is directly embedded, model-based in Tosca Commander, reusing artifacts and doing continuous integration where you take these assets and drag and drop it into an execution list, which runs then in distributed execution, for instance. But the idea is here to have it more on from a functional perspective, which means we try to abstract here technical layers and provide it in a more clean and with less noise. API calls can be very noisy. So this is also where you should try to build more or less a user interface for your API test cases in order to enable functional testers also for API testing. I already mentioned that it's also model-based here, and you can use that for end-to-end and so on and so forth, risk-based, test case design, but these features are available for any technology using in Tosca. Last but not least, of course, OSV, which is our service virtualization product, where you can simulate missing dependencies, for instance, in early stage of development where you have a system which is not available yet, for instance, but you need it in order to test your application, then you can simulate these services with OSV. I will show you an example with it as well. And this helps, of course, to increase automation rates. So service virtualization is really an enabler to do continuous integration, for instance, or increases automation rates. But it also helps with test data issues, for instance, and it enables also load testing, for instance, because we increase the performance in OSV in 11.3 about 5x, so we make up to 2,500 transactions per second, depending, of course, also on the configuration and on the complexity of the messages. But this is what we achieve without load balances, and on an average configuration, like with 2 cores, for instance, we make this lightning speed in request and response per simulation. And in OSV, you can also record queues, but we come to this a little later. All right, let's jump into the first topic we introduced with 12.0, which is the recorder embedded in the API scan. And before I go into this, let me just explain this on high level how this works. For instance, the left box is supposed to be your machine. You're running your local machine, for instance. You have your app like a browser, or could be another app, a mobile app, or like if you have like Slack or any other app which is using other services, distributed services. If you start the recorder, you're recording on the local system proxy. If you guys are familiar with Fiddler tools or other tools which use the same techniques, we are doing the same thing. So when we start the record button, we actually redirect all the traffic via local system proxy. I'll show you this a little in the demo in a little bit more detail. For the experts with OSV, you guys know already we had a recording functionality in OSV. This is still available, of course, and in combination with the API recorder plus the OSV recorder, we tackle more or less the pros and cons of both versions. Like in the API scan, there is less configuration required. That's really just click the record button, and no need for install certificates or rerouting, for instance. You simply can start the recorder right away. And once it's captured, you can directly import it to the API scan and later on use it for service virtualization or for API testing in Tosca. And with the API scan recording functionality, we're also able to break up SSL communication without the need for a certificate because we're doing this all locally. And we can record basically any HTTP traffic of any application, even if it's Outlook or browser-based or whatever. The cons is it's limited to HTTP and HTTPS, and you need sufficient rights to do that. If you have a machine with almost no rights, it might be not possible to activate this feature. But speak to your IT guys, and maybe they can do something for you that you can also use this tool in case if you have a very restrictive environment. So please be aware about this. Just briefly on the OSV recording functionality, you have to use also OSV more or less like some proxy, like a man in the middle. So that's like the cons, and you need to reroute everything. But the positive thing about this approach, you are able to record any kind of technology we support with OSV. For instance, if you want to capture kicks or CICS or RFC, for instance, or other queuing technologies, for instance, you can do this with OSV recording capabilities. So that's not possible with the API recorder. Then you will have to switch to the OSV recording. All right, so it's time to go into the first demo. So let me just minimize this, and here we are. This is our Tosca Commander, and I've embedded here the picture just to memorize a little bit. That's Tosca Commander. And when you go to the API testing ribbon, you find the API Scan icon. When you click on this, the API Scan opens, and just go to back on this picture. So that's the API Scan. I just started here. The connection manager can be started if you click on this icon here. You can see here I have already configured a couple connections here. And when I switch to the OSV ribbon, of course, you need to have OSV installed, and you need to have a license for that. But then in the ribbon, you can start the monitor, basically, which is more or less your window to the service virtualization host, which is in my case running on localhost. But if you run it somewhere distributed, you can start it here. And as you can see here, I'm using localhost now, but the virtualization server could run anywhere else. Good, so that's the overview, and let's have a look at the recorder. So my first chapter is I want to record something, and I want to use it more or less. I create a virtual service for it. So let me just dock this on the right here, and by clicking here on the record button, the recorder window opens. I also will dock it in here. And I will open my browser here. So you guys, if you haven't configured for this yet, so just click on this this button here. You need to have enabled decrypt HTTPS traffic, and then usually when you click on OK, you need to confirm a message box that we use our certificate, and we will break up the SSL communication. All right. So let me just start the recording. And when I start the recorder, for your explanation, if I go onto internet options, so you get an idea of where this is configured. If you go to LAN settings, connections, LAN settings, you see that we're using this here. So when we activate recording, we're using the local system proxy. And you can see already some messages are popping in. And we see that Chrome is sending stuff home. I'm not sure what this is all about, but I did immediately identify that Chrome is even sending messages home, even if we don't really use it. Very interesting, by the way. But let me show you an example, and I will do this with the Aula browser because they're using an API in the backend, which is not too restrictive. You need to know that in production environments, it is sometimes they have some security mechanisms. You can capture these calls, but you cannot immediately reuse them, resend them, because sometimes parameters are valid only for a very short time. But for your testing environment, this should not always be the case, and in many cases this works, but then you need to speak with your dev how you can work around this. All right, you see there's a lot of traffic going on. Even just started the website here. You can see here the Chrome, also Tosca is sending some things because I have enabled diagnostics on my machine. But if I would have running any other application, I would see here that's the process switch using it. We can see the content type, if it's HTML or whatever, URL, host. I think that's the rest is pretty much self-explaining. It's status codes and timestamp. And of course, because there is so much noise, we need the filter capabilities. Okay, so since I want to work with the Aula application, I probably would start to set a filter here. So I just type in here Aula, and I will pick here, for instance, those. So you can immediately see it's getting less. And what I will do here is I will type in here Tricentis and just searching on Aula. Aula is just a website where you can have a look at companies, or what's the size of companies, etc. And hold on, I've obviously Tricentis. Okay, so when I click on this, it shows me all the stats about Tricentis. And you see there's a lot of stuff going on, and we need to reduce the noise. So what I will do is, first of all, just try to also add the static Aula. And usually when you work with APIs, it's a good idea to filter for application JSON, right? Because this is usually what REST services use. Meanwhile, it could also be application XML, but in this case, it's application JSON. And if I activate this, I can see it's much less communication I have in here. So I can have a look at the calls here, right? So you see here there's a lot of technical information we don't always need to be interested to. And for instance, right now I don't want to walk through all this, so what I would do now is I simply clear it and I just load this again. So it just shows me 2 entries now. I can see the first one. I see, all right, that's actually what I am looking for, 559 employees. The second one, oh, that's something else. I'm not really interested into this. I only want to check the companies. So what I will do now is I will press the export button. And when I do that, it pushes this captured call actually directly into the API scan. And you can see here I've traced message. And when I perform pretty print, it gives me a better view on this, on the request. And when I switch to the response and I perform pretty print, it performs also well formed, but also gives some highlighting, so it's better readable. So that looks already much better than the captured call. And I simply call this get Tricentis. And I will also record a couple more. For instance, I don't know, let's capture another company, which is, let's choose Tesla, for instance. This must be these guys. When you go for Tesla, so we should have the call here somewhere. Oh yeah, that's the Tesla, and I'm gonna use this. Call it get Tesla. And let's do one more. I search for Paradoxon, because in my opinion these guys doing the best computer games. Paradoxon Interactive. Alright, so this should be it. Yeah, export this one. Okay, get Paradoxon. Alright, cool. So we have 3 API calls, and let me just pretty print it. And if I like, I can also resend them. So when I send the request, I get back the same call. So I can rerun and can try it out. I could, for instance, insert or manipulate this here, but I'm not sure about the company ID. I wouldn't know that by heart, for instance. But this is where you also can play around. And once you have this, you let me just move this into a test case. So I create a folder. I call this test Aula company API. Right. So paste this in here. So it would just Paradoxon, Tesla, Tricentis. So that's good for me. If I would be a technical user, that's not a big thing for me. And what I want to do now is I want to move this to the next level where I can reuse this for regression testing. So I will simply, let me make this a little bigger. I will take this and export this as API test case. But before I do that, I want to show you how I can create a virtual service out of this very easily. So I have this capture call here. I can see that's my request payload, and this is what I would expect as a response payload. Okay, let's 3D print it. And what I want to do now is I can deploy this directly from the API scan to my virtualization. It takes the name from the message name here, and my username, credentials. It's running a local host, and I push it into the OSV environment. So when I do this, and I just open my OSV monitor and I check in my OSV monitor for a label, I can see that the paradoxon has been pushed into my virtualization and it's ready to be used. So when I, for instance, would send a request to service work to my OSV, then OSV would answer this. But now the endpoint still points to the Aula API. And if I want to use it as a virtual service, I simply would use, for instance, let's call it, I have a virtual REST service here. So when I click this, it is HTTP localhost 10,001. And just for you guys, you understand, oh yeah, it's not 10,001, so it's 10,002. And you can update this in the so-called connection manager, right? So I have this virtual REST service here, and I simply would change it here. Let's close it, and you can see everywhere I was using this connection gets now updated. Okay, so this is how you can make use of the connection manager. If you have, for instance, a new connection, if you have, for instance, you want to use the Aula connection, you could click on this button, create new one, right? Then I just call this connection here, call it Aula. So this is how you can create new connections out of an existing one, right? And this would be now also, you see it's already gets automatically set. So this is how you can use the connection manager, create new connections, but also reuse existing one or change them in the UI. But let me send this request to OSV, and we get back the response. And if I check in my OSV, I can see OSV has executed this. So this was a completely 100% virtualized API call to Paradoxon. I can also upload the others, for instance. If I mark multiple calls, it just says count, and it will use the names for the scenarios from the messages here, and it's more or less a bulk upload. So I can, if I switch here to my virtual REST service, this can also be virtualized then. Okay, so this is how you can very easily create virtual services out of captured API calls. And if you need it quick, that's probably the best way to use this shortcut. So I can stop recording here now. Let's clear this. And just recap here what I did. I captured the calls with the API scan and I directly pushed it into OSV. And then I used the API scan tool to trigger these calls. But of course, if my system on a test would send these calls to OSV, they also would get a reply. And I was using the connection manager in order to configure my connections, and you will see a little later that I also can make use of them here in Tosca Commander. Okay, but that was about the service virtualization. But what I will do now is I will reuse this for API testing, and to do so I will simply mark this folder and say, okay, export this as an API test case, and I simply click this button. And that's the advantage of using the API scan in combination with Tosca, because you can push directly these artifacts into Tosca Commander workspace. You see, you get the modules here, but you get also a test case. And this is also a test case which you can run. But of course, as of now, if I would run it, I would not be able to parameterize anything besides in the technical layer. and I could also not verify anything. In order to do so, for you guys, you know who are familiar with this, you could mark this here, create here a module attribute and so on for a resource or for anything you want to parameterize. But with 12.0, we introduced the so-called smart API parameter assistant. We don't really have a name for it. The only thing you can do is here, you mark a folder, your module level or a module, wherever you like. You simply mark this folder, but it needs to contain modules and test cases. And when you click this button, a window opens, which more or less analyzes everything which is beneath my selection. And when you scroll over this, you can see, okay, this is 3 modules where you find, for instance, the blog RSS enable, whatever this means. And it shows us it is available in 3 modules, and it has 2 different variations, true and false. So why we're doing that, it is because if something is in 3 modules and it has only 1 occurrence, it is probably not really relevant, or at least in my selection, there were no variations. So the question is, why should you even create a business parameter for this or a module attribute for it? Because it always remains the same, unless you want to verify it, of course. But the idea is also just to expose the most relevant things you need. And you can use this, for instance, and what I will do now is I will pick more or less things I would like to verify, for instance. Let me just use here the short name, then let's also check the followers count or a medium logo, for instance. Now let's use the CEO picture, followers count. So you more or less have an abstracted layer where you can simply choose what you want. So let's check the first name of the CEO, and let me just find also the last name. But you see already here you can select whatever you need for your test. And let's check out also the revenue. Here is something, let's a short name, of course. We want to test, or we want to check where in the state where they are, state name, status, whatever makes sense from for your perspective, you just would pick it here. And once you've done it, you simply click on add. So what our feature here does, it creates parameters for all the attributes you have chosen. And it also expresses it here in the test case. So you, for instance, for get paradoxon, you would verify the last name of the CEO and the revenue, where they are, for instance, they are new, for instance, short name, how they are called, their CEO, and so on and so forth. So this is what came out by my selection. Here is like Tesla, Elon Musk, we probably all know this guy. And of course, at Tricentis, we all know Sandeep. And this is already a working test case, and I can move this already into my execution list. Let me just do that. And let's just run this. So from the recording, I moved it into Tosca, I created some business parameter with my assistant, and I'm done. So this is how you can pretty smart create API test cases with our new recording function. So this analyzing function, of course, so this smart parameterizer, as we call it internally, works on the most of the technologies, and no matter if you have recorded it or created out of a WSTL. And we've seen the test was fine, so everything is still okay. So we could use this for our regression testing, for instance, to test the other API. All right, maybe one more thing. For instance, if you have something like this, a link, and you can use this in the API scan, for instance, if you just want to quick check something. I've got here an URL, for instance, and I send it, and it's a picture, and we get the picture of the Paradoxon CEO, for instance. So you basically can use this not only for API testing, you can use it for anything. For instance, if you have like a website, let me do this. Tricentis.com, and send it, you get back the HTML doc type. And if you move this into Tosca, and you get this, and for instance, you want to only check, for instance, if the status code is okay and if it's the response time is fine. So what you can do is also not only on API tests, you could do this, for instance, for any kind of HTML page, for instance. For instance, if you have like API tests, the first thing you might do is check if the website is available, for instance. And you can simply do that with this kind of approach and then run the API calls. So it's not limited only to APIs. You can do this for any HTTP traffic you record, capture, or just as I did, I modeled it manually. All right, guys, I hope you like the API recording. So let's switch to the next topic. And the next topic is about JMS. I think, Federico, we have some minutes left, right?
Yeah, you can go on.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, because I still have something to show, and it's JMS. With 11.3, we introduced JMS for Tosca. It's not the newest feature, but I also want to show you this functionality. In JMS, it's a little different to HTTP, but we introduced it for several reasons. But let me just explain a little bit the concept for the guys who are not so familiar with that. With queues and topics, usually you have a producer on the left side. This could be Tosca regression test. This could also OSV could be this, or the API Scan can also push messages, for instance, onto a queue. Like in my example, I will have a request and a response queue. And on the other side, there's usually a consumer pulling these messages and processing it and pushing a response back whenever he is ready to do so. The advantage by this is, if, for instance, the consumer is not there, the messages will not be lost. So just imagine you go to a cash machine, you get some money, and for some reason the bank service is not available, you wouldn't get any money. But for these kind of situations, you might using queues, your request gets handled, for instance, your cash request will stay in the queue and will be processed as soon the service on the other side is able to process it, for instance, and then it will be published, for instance, somewhere else. So this is more or less the concept. Of course, there's much more behind it, but it's just a very high-level explanation I did here. And with topics, it's a little different, where you can subscribe on topics and so on and so forth. Just check out the Wikipedia website. This gives a pretty good explanation about this. But the good thing is, in Tosca, we support this with all our API tools. And why we're doing this, for instance, if you have an architecture, a modern architecture, you have on top here usually the customer-facing applications, like mobile applications, but also browser apps. This is what Tricentis is able to do, of course, doing testing. But here already starts with API testing, but more or less with web APIs, which is typically REST, but in the past more SOAP. But of course also in SAP context, it's OData, for instance. But here is where you need middleware. For instance, queues topics, where IBM, Oracle, or ActiveMQ, or TIBCO, and my example will be with TIBCO. And the further you go down, the more legacy you will find. But also, of course, files testing the further you go down, or on the very end you do database testing. But with Tosca, we support all these stages, stages of an enterprise system landscape, and this makes us very unique because we can test all across the enterprise. You start on a UI, for instance, in the end you check with the database, or you push something onto a topic and check, for instance, if somewhere a file gets placed, and so on and so forth. So this is what our tool provides. And let me give you a short demo on this. I hope I can make this a little faster than the previous one. So in my example, what I will do is I will scan in a schema, and this will be a Swift schema, for instance. I've prepared here Swift XSD. I downloaded it from the ISO 20022 website. So here is the schema for cache management. So when I scan this, we get more or less of an example of this, and I can scan, for instance, or I add an instance for that. So if I can immediately validate this in here because I was reading this from the schema. And what I can do now is here, before I was only doing HTTP, and in my connection manager, I've also configured all kind of GMS technologies, like here TipGo, here's my request queue. And you can see here, once I click on this, I can see here, you can pick the technologies, you give it a name, give it the queue topic name, that's the way it's configured on the broker, and so on and so forth. And once it's configured here, I can choose it here, for instance, request queue. And once you did it, according to the technology, we can see immediately that this switches, the UI switches to push because it's a GMS technology. So I can make use of push and pull functionality, and I simply will push this message onto the request queue. The same way I executed, for instance, before an HTTP call, and it reports back it was deployed successful. That's pretty cool. So I call this push message, and then I simply will duplicate this and I will pull this because I will reuse this later for my regression testing. So let me clear this. Just remove this because we want to pull the message we just pushed on the queue. For the guys who understand this technology a little better, that's a very basic example. And of course, on the other side of the queue will be somebody else picking it up, processing the message, and would push a message onto the queue, and I would pull usually this message from the queue now. But for this example, I simply will pull the same message from the queue again. And as soon I switch from push to pull, you see, I get also the selector field here. And if I don't feel anything in here, I take the on top message. But you can also configure here, of course, a selector, for instance, to pick a message based on correlation ID or some other content, for instance. I'm not doing this in here because that's different for all the vendors, how the selectors work. And if I leave this blank, I will pull the on top message. So when I run this again, I receive the message I just pushed onto the queue. If I do this again, then I might also run into the problem that there is no message on the queue, and for this we have also no message on the queue, for instance. Okay. So what I will do now is the same approach as before, test queue, and I simply will export this as an API test case to Tosca. So that's the same approach as before. And you can see I also get modules and push, pull, and I can also again perform my parameter here. For instance, I will just pick everything in here, and it creates the test case for me. First I push it, and then I pull the message and I verify. Also verify if the response time, probably give it a little more, like 500 milliseconds. And I can reuse this also in my regression testing. And I can rerun my test here. So let me just try this, if this works. Okay, so we can see everything went fine. And so that's about the enterprise middleware testing. Okay. All right, so there is one more topic I want to show you guys, and I briefly want to speak about, before I go into this, about the service virtualization modes we provide in OSV. I will not talk about all of them, but the most relevant ones. With version 10.0, so it's quite a while ago, it's about 2 years ago, we released the so-called forwarding mode for service virtualization, which means you have service virtualization between your application and your backend systems. And with the forwarding mode, whenever OSV has, for instance, a request response pair, it will reply with the virtualized one. and in case it does not has a matching pattern, it will simply forward it and will get the response. I will send the response from the real application. So that's the forwarding, where you more or less have virtualized services and real services in a mixed mode. In the so-called recording mode, you can make use of the recording functionality, for instance, in a normal processing mode when you run the tests, and whenever something passes through, OSV can capture this, and you can create virtual services out of this. So the next time it would be already virtualized. So this is the learning mode, when you can capture calls which are passing through. Of course, the ones who have been virtualized will not be captured then. That's the learning mode, and with 12.0 we introduced the so-called fallback service virtualization mode, which means you run your tests and it goes to the real application, and as long the real application responds, that's no problem. So because ideally we want to use the real application, and only in case the real application responds with a status code 500, or it doesn't respond within a configurable time frame. For instance, if it doesn't respond within 2 seconds, then please OSV jump in and provide a virtual response, because if this application doesn't respond, we will never make it to this step, for instance. So this means when you run your tests and one of your servers passes out, OSV just can jump in and provide your test with a virtual service. Then we have our OSV environment configured here, and this feature works only on OSV environment level. So we click here, go to environment settings, and as you can see here already, I've configured the fallback mode, and once it's enabled, and you can configure, for instance, status code in case if a 500 error gets returned, OSV would jump in, or if the response takes longer than, like, let's make 2 seconds, like that's 2000 milliseconds. If my service doesn't respond within 2 seconds, OSV will jump in case it has a virtual scenario available, or in case the service returns status code 500 error, which could be faster than like in 2000 milliseconds. So once you've configured this, you need to restart your environment, and once it's restarted, it is in fallback mode. And in order to demo this feature, I have here our so-called insurance calculator application. It has a built vehicle service here, and I will simply, let me close the recorder here. So let's dock this in here. Let's bring this up here. So I will scan just the whistle here. When I click on this, it copies the endpoint to the clipboard, and I will scan just the whistle directly from the service here. So I've scanned this from this car service here, and when I perform here BMW and I send this request to this endpoint, I will see I get BMW call here, and that's the real application returning my response now. So what I will do now is I will upload this request and response pair, and I will just do a slight adoption here, and I call this virtual BMW. And I will just so it's easier to distinguish which one was the real one and which one was the virtual one. And let me rename this to get BMW. So I will use the same feature as before. I will push this directly into OSV again. That's already pre-configured. So just click OK. And it has been already there, so I just simply replace it. And we can see here in available, I find here is get BMW that I've just uploaded. And I will, of course, have to redirect my application to the virtual service now. And I'm using my virtual vehicle service, which is using this 10,002 endpoint. So when I send this request to OSV, because that's actually the OSV virtual service endpoint, I get the real response. I can see also here that the application gets my call and responds. Okay. But if my system is not available, for instance, now, remember I've configured a 2 seconds timeout. So I will shut down this vehicle service now, and I will just retry the same thing. So I will run it, and it will wait 2 seconds. It OSV realizes, oh, the service is not available, so it will jump in with my virtual scenario. And as soon the service goes live again, it responds with the real application again. So this makes my automation very robust, and ideally I use always the real application, of course, but as soon it passes out or it just reacts not as we expect, for instance, with a different status code, our OSV will be able to jump in, and this will make it possible to stabilize our automation, especially in environments where we want to do end-to-end testing. And of course, this also reported here in the log. Once, for instance, failed to connect to the real application and the operation has timed out, and it says performing a fallback virtualization. So you can will also find out, okay, the service didn't work, and that's reported here in the OSV log. All right, so that's it from my side. That's I hand back to Federico. Federico, are there any questions so far?
Yeah, well, a lot are coming in. We will have time to cover just a couple of them, but let's get started. So, question number 1. Can you also capture TCP traffic with the new recorder?
That's a good question. Basically, TCP traffic, I guess you mean like a protocol which operates only on TCP level. With the API recorder, that's not feasible. It's only possible to do HTTP, and we're thinking maybe of FTP, but it probably will never be able to capture TCP traffic. But remember what I've said about OSV. Potentially with OSV, if OSV supports this protocol, you could capture it potentially with OSV, but not with the API recorder, and that was the question about. Sorry for that.
Well, a complex answer to a complex question, I would say.
Yeah.
So let's move to question number 2. Do you guys also support IBM MQ?
Oh yeah, sure. This was actually one of the first technologies we had. Yes, we support this. Like TIBCO, RabbitMQ. Just check out our website, what we support there. And of course, we support also IBM MQ in the API scan for API testing, in Tosca for regression testing, but also for service virtualization.
Okay, and well, let's now move to the last question. Do you support database virtualization?
Database. I have this request I had many times so far. As of now, we don't support database virtualization, and there are multiple reasons. But the first question, if you really need to do database virtualization, you need to ask yourself if you guys want to do DevOps or Agile, but usually it's not really a problem to provision a database. We built our service virtualization tool, first of all, to provide and provision services which are broken or not available yet, but that's usually not the case with a database. That's usually a problem you have in your organization. And if you have issues with cloning a database, I understand this problem, but that's not really the use case we want to cover there. That's more an organizational issue you guys are facing. And if you can't resolve it, you can reach out to us. If we support it, if we have enough requests for database virtualization, we might do it, but that's not the number one use case we want to address with service virtualization.
Okay, well, thank you for your exhaustive presentation and for all the information that you gave us today. So I want again to thank you, Robert.
Yeah, you're welcome. I know it was a lot of content. I hope you guys, there will be a recording as well. Because
Yeah. If the
probably guys need
recordings,
to do back and forth sometimes.
the recordings will be available immediately after we have finished with the MOOC. We will upload them usually 24 hours after.
All right, thanks.
Speaking of which, I would like to invite you to join us for the next MOOC that will be on the 6th of February. We will go through the TQL reporting. So we will see how to efficiently integrate reports while using the Tosca query language. As usual, I would like you to invite to contact us at support@tricentis.com if you have any issue using our software, or if you want to contact training directly, you can write at academy@tricentis.com if you have training related questions. You can also take a look at our knowledge base and our online manual. Those are always there for you. You can look at previous recordings for MOOC at tricentis.com/academy/MOOC. There you can also enroll yourself for a new MOOC. And additionally, I would like to invite you to bring your MOOC suggestion to the user community. We continuously go there and check what are you asking for, so that if you want something covered, just go there, ask for it, and we'll cover it. You can find us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on Vimeo. We are basically everywhere. So write us, and we will take your suggestions. I would like to thank you again, and thank Robert again.
Thank you guys. Thanks for listening.
And
thanks, Federico.
See you the next MOOC.